January 1942. The Eastern Front of the Second World War is burning from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Leningrad has been suffocating under blockade for 4 months. In the city, hunger, daily shelling, thousands dying from starvation and exhaustion. The Soviet command makes a decision: to launch a strike that will break the German ring. The Second Shock Army of the Volkhov Front is committed to battle. More than 100,000 men, dozens of divisions, artillery, engineers, ski battalions. They must advance through forests and swamps where there are no roads, where in winter the frost kills as surely as bullets, and in spring the ground turns into a deadly mire. On January 7, 1942, the offensive begins. Temperatures drop to -30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers move forward through chest-deep snow. Metal freezes to bare hands. Weapons jam. Men fall asleep in foxholes and freeze to death. The German 18th Army holds a powerful defensive line. Bunkers, barbed wire, minefields, interlocking machine gun fire. Yet the blow comes unexpectedly. In the sector near Myasnoye Bor, Soviet units break through the front. Fighting turns hand-to-hand. German positions are stormed wave after wave. Losses on both sides are enormous. According to German operational reports, in January alone, up to 15,000 to 20,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were killed or wounded in this sector. Soviet losses were even higher, tens of thousands in the first weeks of the offensive. The breakthrough develops rapidly. Units of the Second Shock Army penetrate 60 to 70 kilometers deep into German defenses. It becomes one of the deepest Soviet penetrations in early 1942. On operational maps, a narrow, elongated wedge appears, pointing toward Lyubin, a key railway junction. If the operation succeeds, the blockade of Leningrad will be broken. But the wedge is fatally vulnerable. Its base is a narrow corridor only a few kilometers wide. The entire army depends on a single road through forests and swamps. The German command reacts quickly. Reserves of Army Group North are rushed into the breakthrough sector. Artillery is concentrated along the flanks. The Luftwaffe strikes supply columns. The corridor begins to shrink under constant fire. Every convoy carrying food becomes a target. Horses are torn apart by shrapnel. Trucks sink into snow and become easy prey for artillery. February 1942. The fighting does not stop day or night. Explosions echo through the forests, fires flare, aircraft roar overhead. The Germans launch counterattacks aimed at cutting the supply lines. On both sides, brutal clashes erupt over every kilometer of forest road. Losses continue to rise. In February alone, Soviet forces in this sector lose tens of thousands killed, wounded, or missing. German losses also number in the thousands, but their supply lines remain stable, their positions compact, their artillery precise. The corridor becomes a road of death. Its width shrinks to 2 kilometers, then to just a few hundred meters. Artillery fire pounds it daily. Wounded soldiers are carried out by hand, wading waist-deep through snow. Many die before reaching medical posts. Ammunition begins to run out. Rations are cut. The troops continue advancing even as the strategic situation deteriorates. March brings a thaw. Snow melts, swamps fill with water. Roads disappear. Vehicles sink into mud. Artillery pieces must be dragged by hand. Horses die from exhaustion. Food deliveries become sporadic. Soldiers are reduced to half rations. In some units, only 20 to 30 rounds remain per rifle. The Germans methodically tightened the ring. Their aircraft bombed concentrations of troops in the forests. Artillery shelled every attempt to widen the corridor. According to German reports, in March alone, about 8,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were killed or wounded in battles against the Second Shock Army. But Soviet losses during the same period exceeded 30,000 men. The army's strength was rapidly shrinking. In April 1942, the decisive blow fell. German units converged from the flanks and finally severed the corridor. The Second Shock Army found itself completely encircled. More than 90,000 men remained inside the cauldron. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The artillery fell silent. There were no shells left. Communications broke down. Attempts to relieve the army from the outside collapsed under enemy fire. Now, the Second Shock Army existed inside a vast, swampy pocket, cut by forest clearings and a few narrow roads constantly covered by German artillery fire. By various estimates, between 80,000 and 90,000 men were trapped inside. Truly combat-capable forces were far fewer. The rest were wounded, exhausted, or cut off in isolated groups. Supply had virtually ceased. Attempts to organize air deliveries ran into harsh reality. Spring weather, German air superiority, and a shortage of transport aircraft. Many supply containers dropped from the air, landed on German positions, or disappeared into the swamps. At times, soldiers risked their lives, crawling at night through no man's land to retrieve ammunition crates that had fallen too close to enemy lines. Rations were reduced to a minimum. In some units, the daily bread allowance dropped to 100 to 150 grams. Soon, even that disappeared. Soldiers ate horses. First those killed by shelling, then the last surviving animals were slaughtered. They boiled leather belts and boots, burning them to soften the material. They ate bark, grass, and swamp plants. Severe cases of starvation dystrophy began to appear. Men lost their strength and could no longer rise from the ground. Medical services were paralyzed. Almost no medicines remained. The wounded lay in damp dugouts for weeks. Shrapnel wounds festered. Amputations were performed without anesthesia or with minimal means. Many died of blood poisoning. The dead could not be properly buried. The ground was saturated with water and graves filled in. Corpses lay in the forests, in the swamps, along the roads. Epidemics began to spread. By May, the army had effectively lost half of its strength. According to archival data, only about 35,000 to 40,000 men remained combat capable. The rest had been killed, gone missing, or were physically unable to carry weapons. The Germans methodically dismantled the encircled force. They divided the pocket into sectors, isolated divisions from one another, and destroyed them one by one. Artillery and mortars pounded every detected center of resistance. German losses were also rising. The fighting was fierce, especially in the forests where distances shrank to mere dozens of meters. Soviet soldiers, pinned to the ground, often fought hand to hand. Grenades exploded among the trees, fragments ricocheted off trunks. According to German reports, in May and June alone, the Wehrmacht lost up to 10,000 to 12,000 men killed and wounded during the operation to eliminate the encircled army. But for those trapped inside, that no longer mattered. Their situation was becoming hopeless. The army command attempted to organize a breakout. General Andrei Vlasov was inside the pocket. Communication with front headquarters was unstable. Orders arrived late or did not arrive at all. Several attempts at a mass breakout were made in May. Each time, the attacking troops ran into dense fire barriers. The Germans had created a system of interlocking fire, laid minefields, and reinforced their artillery positions. One of the attacks at the end of May cost the army thousands of lives in just a few days. Exhausted men advanced upright because crawling through water and mud was impossible. Machine gun fire cut down entire assault lines. The wounded drowned in the swampy mire, unable to pull themselves out. June became the final act of the tragedy. The army broke apart into separate groups. Some units lost contact completely and operated independently. In the forests, dozens of small detachments of 50 to 100 men appeared, trying to find their way back to friendly lines. Many became lost and once again ran into German blocking positions. Ammunition was running out completely. In some units, only a few rounds per soldier remained. On June 21st to 24th, 1942, the last large-scale breakout attempt was launched in the area of Myasnoy Bor. It was a desperate effort to escape at any cost. The men moved at night, orienting themselves by the stars and the flashes of gunfire. The Germans were expecting the attack. Their machine guns and artillery operated without interruption. The swamps were strewn with bodies. According to various estimates, up to 8,000 to 10,000 men were killed in those days alone. Only a portion managed to break through, about 10,000 to 15,000 out of the entire army. The rest were either killed or captured. Tens of thousands fell into captivity. Many of them later died in camps from hunger and disease. By July 1942, the Second Shock Army had ceased to exist as an organized force. Total losses are estimated at more than 60,000 to 70,000 killed and missing, plus tens of thousands captured. German losses for the entire operation are estimated, according to various sources, at between 20,000 and 30,000 killed and wounded. The swamps near Miasnoye Bor became a gigantic mass grave. After the end of the Second World War, search teams spent decades recovering the remains of soldiers. Even today, they continue to find identification tags, rifles, helmets, and rusted cartridges. The attempt to break the blockade of Leningrad in 1942 ended in catastrophe. Only a year later, in January 1943, during Operation Iskra, was a land corridor to the city finally established. But for the Second Shock Army, it was already too late. It was one of the most severe and shocking tragedies of the Second World War on the Eastern Front. An army that marched into the swamps and disappeared in fire, hunger, and cold, leaving behind tens of thousands of unmarked graves. But the tragedy of the Second Shock Army was not limited to its final days of encirclement. To understand the scale of the catastrophe, one must look back and see how, step by step, the army fell into a deadly trap. As early as February 1942, division commanders were reporting the critical situation on the flanks. German forces were increasingly pressing along the edges of the breakthrough, attempting to cut off the salient. On operational maps, the front line resembled a long dagger thrust into German defenses. But that dagger was held by a thin handle, the narrow supply corridor. Every day, German artillery pounded the road. According to participants' recollections, traveling along it felt like Russian roulette. Columns moved under constant explosions. Men fell. Horses screamed in pain. Wagons overturned. At times, the road was completely blocked by craters and bodies. Then, it had to be rerouted directly through the forest, over frozen ground, across swampy mire. In mid-March, the German command began a systematic operation to sever the salient. Fresh units were committed to battle, along with artillery of 150 and 210 mm caliber. German forward observers operated from observation posts in trees, directing fire at every moving column. According to German data, in just 1 week of March, more than 200 Soviet wagons and supply trucks were destroyed. Meanwhile, inside the salient, the Second Shock Army continued to carry out its original task, advancing toward Lyuban. But the offensive was now conducted without adequate support. In some divisions, battalion strength had been reduced to 200 to 300 men. Companies numbered only 40 to 50 soldiers. On certain sectors, losses reached 60 to 70% of personnel. A shocking fact. In some rifle units, by April 1942, fewer than 1/3 of their original strength remained in the ranks. The rest had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. When the ring closed in April, the situation became irreversible. Inside the pocket were not only combat units, but also rear services, field hospitals, supply depots, artillery without shells, and thousands of wounded. According to historians' estimates, at the moment of complete encirclement, there were about 80,000 to 90,000 men trapped inside, of whom no more than half were combat capable. The Germans acted methodically. They did not launch frontal assaults unless necessary. Instead, they created internal rings, dividing the encircled forces into isolated pockets. Each pocket was subjected to artillery bombardment, after which infantry moved forward. If resistance was fierce, air support was brought in. The fighting on both sides was brutal. Soviet soldiers, understanding there was nowhere to retreat, fought desperately. According to German reports, The resistance of certain Soviet groups was described as fanatical. Wehrmacht losses in the forest battles sometimes exceeded expected levels. In some German infantry companies, strength dropped by 30 to 40% within just a few days of fighting. But numerical and logistical superiority was on the side of the enemy. German units regularly received reinforcements and ammunition. Their artillery did not fall silent. By May, Soviet artillery had virtually ceased fire due to a lack of shells. A moral collapse began to set in. Hunger eroded discipline. In some cases, attempts were recorded of small groups trying to break out on their own. Men were losing hope. The fate of the wounded was especially grim. Many were left in the forests without evacuation. As German units advanced, they discovered improvised hospitals filled with dozens of emaciated men. Some were taken prisoner. Others died where they lay. In June, the final destruction of the pocket began. The Germans used concentrated artillery fire against narrow breakout sectors. The ground literally exploded underfoot. The forest was shredded by fragments. According to participants' recollections, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay. The last breakout attempt became the climax of the tragedy. Men, exhausted by hunger, with hollow eyes, moved forward under fire. Many carried wounded comrades on their backs. Some threw away their weapons because they had no ammunition left. Machine gun fire tore apart the advancing lines. The swamps swallowed the wounded who were unable to pull themselves free. By rough estimates, up to 15,000 more men were killed in the final weeks of the army's existence. By July 1942, organized resistance had ceased. According to various estimates, between 30,000 and 40,000 men were taken prisoner. Many of them did not survive the camps. The overall picture is staggering in scale. Of the more than 100,000 men who began the operation in January, no more than 10,000 to 15,000 reached friendly lines. The dead and missing numbered in the tens of thousands. German losses during the entire campaign against the Second Shock Army are estimated, according to various sources, at between 20,000 and 30,000 killed and wounded. This was not merely a military failure. It was a catastrophe on the scale of an entire army in the Second World War. When the last pockets of resistance of the Second Shock Army were suppressed in late June and early July 1942, the battlefield near Myasnoye Bor presented a scene that shocked even seasoned veterans of the Second World War. The forest was shredded by shrapnel. Trees stood with charred trunks, their branches cut away by artillery fire. In the lowlands lay bodies, on open clearings, in craters, in the swampy mire. German units clearing the area recorded an enormous number of dead. In a number of reports, it was noted that Soviet troops had been exhausted to the extreme. In some places, entire groups of soldiers were found who had died of hunger or wounds without firing a single shot in their final days. They simply no longer had the strength to rise. The prisoners looked just as horrific. According to German officers' testimonies, many of those captured were skeletons in greatcoats. Starvation dystrophy, swelling, frostbite, festering wounds. Some prisoners died within the first weeks after their capture. A shocking fact. Of the tens of thousands of soldiers of the Second Shock Army who were taken prisoner, a significant portion did not survive 1942 to 1943. Conditions in prisoner-of-war camps on the Eastern Front were extremely harsh. Lack of food, disease, and absence of medical care. But the tragedy did not end there. After the destruction of the army, the front stabilized. The blockade of Leningrad continued. The attempt to break it in 1942 ended in failure at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. Only in January 1943 did Operation Iskra succeed in creating a narrow land corridor to the city. But that was a different operation and a different army. For the Soviet command, the destruction of the Second Shock Army was a heavy blow. Conclusions were drawn about the need for more secure flank protection, better coordination between fronts, and the concentration of reserves. But for those who remained in the swamps of the Volkhov, those conclusions no longer mattered. A special place in this story belongs to the fate of the army's commander, Andrei Vlasov. Captured in July 1942, he later defected to Germany, becoming one of the most controversial figures of the Second World War. However, by the time of his capture, the army had already been destroyed. The fate of tens of thousands of soldiers had been sealed long before that. The battlefields near Myasnoy Bor became a symbol of tragedy. After the end of the Second World War, search teams worked in those forests and swamps for decades. They continue to find remains to this day. Searchers recover identification tags, helmets, rifles, rusted grenades. Sometimes a name can be established. More often, it cannot. The swamps slowly give up their dead. Historians still debate the exact figures of the losses, but most estimates agree on one point. Total losses of the Second Shock Army, killed, missing, died of wounds, and captured, exceeded 60,000 to 70,000 men. Between 30,000 and 40,000 were taken prisoner. German losses during the operation against this army amounted to between 20,000 and 30,000 killed and wounded. It was one of the largest and most shocking army-level catastrophes of the Second World War on the Eastern Front. The Second Shock Army went into the offensive in the winter of 1942 with the mission of changing the course of the war in the northwestern sector. It broke through the front, pushed deep into enemy defenses, but found itself in a deadly trap. Hunger, the spring thaw, artillery fire, isolation, lack of ammunition. All of this transformed a powerful army formation into scattered pockets of resistance, and then into a mass grave among the swamps. In the summer of 1942, the army ceased to exist. But if we look deeper, the destruction of the Second Shock Army is not only a chronicle of encirclement and annihilation, it is the story of a mounting strategic miscalculation that became fatal. From the very beginning of the operation in January 1942, there was a risk. The offensive was conducted under conditions of insufficient reserves. The Volkhov Front did not have enough forces to reliably secure the flanks of the breakthrough. The Stavka demanded quick results, to break the blockade of Leningrad at any cost. But the operational depth of the breakthrough exceeded the front's ability to hold its base. By February 1942, it had already become clear that the German defense had not collapsed. It had merely bent. Army Group North was transferring units from relatively quiet sectors. German commanders acted deliberately. They did not attempt to eliminate the breakthrough immediately. Instead, they allowed the Second Shock Army to advance even deeper, stretch its communications, and exhaust its supplies. It was a strategy of attrition. In March, the Germans launched a systematic counteroffensive along the flanks. The density of artillery fire in the breakthrough sectors increased several-fold. Shells of 105 and 150 mm caliber literally pulverized the forest. According to eyewitness accounts, trees fell like matchsticks, and the ground trembled from continuous explosions. Inside the salient, a supply crisis was already becoming evident. Ammunition was being expended faster than it could be delivered. In some divisions, artillery had only 3 to 5 shells per gun per day. This effectively meant the loss of fire support. By April 1942, the Army's combat capability had sharply declined. Of the original force of more than 100,000 men, only about 45,000 to 50,000 remained as effective fighting troops. The rest had been taken out of action. Losses over 3 months of fighting had become catastrophic. A shocking fact. In some rifle divisions, by the time of encirclement, less than 20% of their authorized strength remained. Battalions were consolidated into companies, companies into platoons. After complete encirclement, a new phase began. Psychological. The men understood that help might never come. Communication with front headquarters was unstable. Attempts at relief operations failed. The troops felt abandoned, even though efforts to assist them were indeed being made. The Germans increased the pressure. They used the so-called tightening ring tactic, gradually reducing the area of encirclement and delivering concentrated strikes against the weakest sectors. Continuous artillery barrages thundered through the forests. Aircraft bombed troop concentrations, supply depots, and suspected headquarters. By May, mass starvation had begun within the army. Exhaustion became the norm. Soldiers lost 10 to 15 kilograms in weight. Many developed edema from starvation dystrophy. Some collapsed during marches and never rose again. Meanwhile, German losses were also significant. The operation to eliminate a large encircled force required considerable resources. According to various estimates, total Wehrmacht losses in battles against the Second Shock Army over the entire course of the operation may have reached 25,000 to 30,000 killed and wounded. Particularly heavy fighting occurred in the forests, where Soviet units offered fierce resistance. But the difference lay in resources. The Wehrmacht had supply depots, reinforcements, artillery, and air power. The encircled troops had only the remnants of ammunition and physical strength that was rapidly fading. June became the month of final disintegration. The Army headquarters effectively lost control over many formations. Units acted in isolation. Attempts at a centralized breakout came too late. The final mass breakout on June 21st to 24th became an act of desperation. According to participants' accounts, the men advanced with minimal ammunition, many having gone without food for several days. Enemy machine gun positions operated without interruption. The waterlogged swamps swallowed the wounded. Thousands were killed. Those who managed to break through looked exhausted, barely able to stand. Many died even after reaching friendly lines, from wounds, exhaustion, and disease. By July 1942, the army had been destroyed. This catastrophe became one of the most severe on the Soviet-German front in 1942. The swamps near Myasnoye Bor turned into a vast mass grave. And even today, decades later, the earth there still preserves the traces of that tragedy. After the encircled force was eliminated in July 1942, the battlefield near Myasnoye Bor did not become quiet. It became silent. German units continued clearing the area, collecting trophies, and forming prisoners into columns. The forest was strewn with abandoned equipment, shattered artillery pieces, mortars without shells, overturned wagons. On some positions, artillery crews were found dead beside their guns, with empty ammunition crates. It is still difficult to determine the exact losses. Archives provide different figures, but the scale of the tragedy remains unchanged. Tens of thousands killed, tens of thousands captured, divisions destroyed, formations wiped from the map. At the beginning of the operation, the army numbered more than 100,000 men. By July, no more than 10,000 to 15,000 had managed to reach friendly lines in organized groups. The rest were killed, captured, or went missing in the swamps. A shocking detail. In some swampy areas, the bodies of the dead lay for weeks and months without burial. Spring waters rose and carried away the remains. After the war, search teams found entire sectors where shell craters were filled with bones and fragments of equipment. Sometimes identification tags were discovered, the only chance to establish a name. But often the tags were empty or had decayed. For the German side, the operation was not an easy walk either. The destruction of a large encircled army required considerable forces. Fighting in the forests and swamps led to heavy losses. According to researchers' estimates, total Wehrmacht losses during the battles with the Second Shock Army may have reached 25,000 to 30,000 killed and wounded. Losses were particularly high among the infantry, which fought at close quarters under extremely difficult conditions. Strategically, however, the German command achieved its objective. The salient was eliminated, the front stabilized, and the blockade of Leningrad continued. In 1942, the attempt to lift it by force ended in failure. For the Soviet command, this became a bitter lesson. An offensive without reliable flank security, without sufficient reserves and stable supply, led to catastrophe. In subsequent operations in 1943 on this sector, these mistakes were taken into account. Denser artillery preparation, concentration of reserves, and stricter control over communications. But those lessons were learned at the cost of an army. The fates of individual soldiers dissolved into overall statistics. Many families did not know for years where and how their relatives had died. Official notifications stated, "Missing in action." For thousands of people, this meant uncertainty that lasted for decades. In the post-war years, the area around Myasnoye Bor became one of the largest sites of search operations. Expeditions recovered remains every year. Sometimes dozens of bodies were lifted from a single trench. The swamps seemed to slowly return their memory. Historians still debate whether the destruction of the Second Shock Army could have been avoided. Some argue that the decision to launch a deep offensive was justified by the overall strategic situation at the beginning of 1942. Others speak of miscalculations and an overestimation of one's own capabilities. But the fact remains, the army was committed to battle, pushed deep into enemy defenses, and was cut off. The Second World War on the Eastern Front was fought on a scale where not battalions or divisions perished, entire armies did. The Second Shock Army became one of the most tragic examples. If one attempts to grasp the scale of the tragedy in numbers, it becomes almost incomprehensible. In January 1942, the Second Shock Army entered the offensive as a full-fledged army formation. Several rifle divisions, separate brigades, artillery units, engineers, rear services. It was a complex organism designed for a deep operation. But by May, that organism was effectively disintegrating into fragments. In some divisions, by the end of spring 1942, only 1,500 to 2,000 men remained instead of the authorized 10,000 to 12,000. Artillery regiments had only a few operational guns. Ammunition was distributed literally round by round. Mortar batteries fired while conserving every single shell. The soldiers trapped inside the pocket often did not understand the full picture of what was happening. Communication with headquarters broke down. Orders arrived with delays. In the forests and swamps, orientation was difficult. At night, units could lose contact with one another at distances of only a few hundred meters. Added to this was the psychological factor. Constant shelling, hunger, lack of sleep, and the sense of being trapped. Men spent weeks under fire. Dugouts were damp, water seeped through the ceilings. Clothes never dried. Lice, infections, exhaustion, all became part of daily life. German units fighting against the encircled army recorded in their reports the exceptional stubbornness of Soviet troops. There were cases when small groups of 20 to 30 men held their positions until their last cartridge. But strategically, such resistance could no longer change the outcome. In mid-June 1942, the German command intensified strikes against the anticipated breakout directions. Artillery operated almost continuously. The ground trembled. According to participants' recollections, the forest was reduced to splinters. One of the most shocking aspects was the density of losses in the final weeks. In some attacks, battalions lost up to half their strength within a few hours. Men advanced knowing their chances were minimal, but they had no choice. The breakout of June 21st to 24th became the culmination. Exhausted fighters, many without proper food for weeks, attacked under fire. The waterlogged swamps turned into traps. The wounded drowned if they could not rise. By rough estimates, up to 8,000 to 10,000 men were killed in those few days. By July 1942, virtually no organized units remained within the encirclement. Scattered groups either broke through in small detachments or were captured. German reports recorded the mass surrender of exhausted soldiers. For many, captivity became the only chance to survive, although the conditions of imprisonment were extremely harsh. After the war, the site of the army's destruction became a symbol of tragedy. Search teams recovered remains for decades. Each identification tag found meant a restored name. But thousands remained nameless. When the last attempts at an organized breakout were crushed in fire and swampy mire, the fate of the Second Shock Army became only a matter of time. Lieutenant General Andrei Vlasov was inside the encircled grouping at the critical moment. In the spring of 1942, when the army was already losing control and cohesion. He arrived at the army in April, when the situation was effectively catastrophic. By that point, communications had been almost severed, supply lines disrupted, and the combat effectiveness of the formations sharply reduced. The army headquarters moved from one forest shelter to another, trying to avoid artillery bombardments. Communication with the front headquarters was intermittent. In May and June, attempts were made to organize a centralized breakout. But each time, the German forces operating against the pocket anticipated the directions of attack. The breakout of June 21st to 24th became the last major attempt. After it, the army effectively disintegrated. Vlasov left the Stab Group only after organized command had virtually ceased to exist. He was among those who tried to break out in small groups. These were not combat columns, but exhausted detachments of several dozen men moving through forests without maps, without communications, and almost without food. The shocking aspect is that the commander of an army found himself in the position of an ordinary encircled officer, without an army, without a headquarters, without a stable front line. In early July 1942, Vlasov, together with a small group, attempted to hide in villages and forests in territory already controlled by German forces. According to various sources, he was detained by a German patrol on July 12, 1942, near one of the villages in the Novgorod region. By that time, the Second Shock Army had effectively ceased to exist. Tens of thousands of its soldiers had been killed, gone missing, or were already in captivity. Its artillery had been destroyed or abandoned. Its headquarters was scattered. The capture of the army's commander became a significant propaganda success for the German side. For the Soviet side, it was a heavy moral blow. But it must be understood, by the time Vlasov was captured, the army had already been destroyed as a fighting force. He did not fall into captivity at the head of an organized formation. He was among those who were simply trying to survive after the catastrophe. Later, Vlasov would become the central figure in one of the most controversial episodes of the Second World War on the Eastern Front. His defection to Germany and participation in the creation of the Russian Liberation Army would become a separate chapter of history. But that chapter began precisely in the swamps of the Volkhov, among the ruins of a shattered army. By that moment, the fate of the Second Shock Army had already been sealed. Of the more than 100,000 men who entered the offensive in the winter of 1942, by summer, only a small number of survivors remained in the ranks. Losses exceeded 60,000 to 70,000 killed and missing. Up to 30,000 to 40,000 were taken prisoner. German losses amounted to up to 25,000 to 30,000 killed and wounded. An army intended to break the blockade of Leningrad found itself trapped in a deadly ring. And in July 1942, with the capture of its commander, this tragedy reached its final, irreversible conclusion.